I heard my daughter laughing in the car before she drove away. "Mom signed everything," she whispered. "We got the lake house." That was the moment I realized the woman I raised had not come to protect me after my husband died. She came for the house he spent his entire life building, and suddenly, every kind phone call, every concerned visit, every gentle question about my health felt like part of something much darker. At 68 years old, I thought grief after losing my husband would be the hardest thing I ever survived. I was wrong. Nothing prepares you for discovering your own child has been quietly planning your downfall. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how our stories connect people from all around the world. Your comments and thoughts bring this community to life, and we're so grateful to have you on this journey with us. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, grab a cozy seat, maybe a cup of coffee or tea, and prepare yourself for a tale that will captivate your heart from beginning to end. Let's begin. My name is Evelyn Mercer. I am 68 years old, and every morning I wake up before the sun touches the lake behind my house in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. For 32 years, my husband Richard and I built a life here, one careful decision at a time. We did not inherit money. We did not win anything. Richard works 6 days a week running a small marine repair business, and I manage the bookkeeping for a furniture store in town. Every room in this house came from years of overtime, canceled vacations, and secondhand furniture we slowly replaced piece by piece as life became kinder to us. Now, 2 years after Richard died from a sudden stroke, the house feels both full and empty at the same time. I still follow the routines we created together because routines are sometimes the only thing holding grief in place. Every morning, I grind coffee beans in the same silver grinder Richard bought during a road trip through Michigan 20 years ago. I stand at the kitchen counter while the coffee brews and look through the large windows facing the lake. In summer, the water glows pale gold before sunrise. In winter, the shoreline looks cold and silent enough to swallow every thought in your head. Most mornings, I take my kayak out just after dawn. The lake is quiet then, before tourists fill the marinas and vacation homes wake up for the day. Out there on the water, I can still hear Richard laughing in my memory. He loved this lake, loved the smell of cedar docks and gasoline from old boat engines. Sometimes I still catch myself turning my head, expecting to see him behind me. After kayaking, I water the lavender bushes lining the stone path beside the house. I volunteer at the local library 3 afternoons a week and host a small reading group for women around my age every Thursday evening. Keeping busy became my way of surviving after Richard died. If I stopped moving for too long, the silence in the house became unbearable. My daughter Vanessa says I should slow down. Vanessa lives in Chicago with her husband Todd Hale. She works in interior design, or at least something connected to luxury staging and renovation projects. Her social media pages are full of rooftop restaurants, expensive wine, and photographs where everyone smiles too hard. Todd is the kind of man who always sounds confident, even when he has no reason to be. Over the years, he invested in restaurants, vacation rentals, cryptocurrency, and at least 3 businesses I never fully understood. None of them lasted. Still, after Richard passed away, Vanessa started calling more often. At first, I was grateful for it. She asked whether I was eating enough, whether I felt safe living alone beside the lake, whether the winters were becoming too difficult for me to manage by myself. I believe those questions came from love. Maybe they did in the beginning. But eventually, the conversations changed. She started asking whether I had updated my will after Richard died, whether the deed to the house was still only in my name, whether I had thought about what might happen if I fell someday and could not make decisions for myself. The questions were always wrapped carefully in concern, but something underneath them no longer felt warm. One evening near the end of October, I stood alone beside the living room windows, watching the sun disappear over the lake while Vanessa spoke on the phone about future planning. Her voice sounded smooth and rehearsed, almost too casual. And for the first time since Richard died, a quiet feeling moved through me that I could not explain. Not fear exactly. Something colder than that. If you are still watching and already feeling suspicious about where this story is heading, comment number 1 below so I know you are here with me. Because what happened after those papers were signed changed everything. By late October, the air around Lake Geneva had started turning sharp and cold. The tourists disappeared first. Then the boats vanished from the docks one by one until the lake looked empty enough to belong only to the wind. I kept myself busy the way I always did. I baked cinnamon bread on Sundays, volunteered at the library during the week, and trimmed the dying lavender bushes before the first frost settled over the shoreline. Still, something inside me had shifted after those conversations with Vanessa. She called almost every day now. If I missed one call, she left 2 voice messages asking whether I had fallen or forgotten my phone somewhere in the house. She sent me articles about elderly scams and stories about widows who slipped on icy stairs while living alone. Every conversation somehow circled back to the same thing. Aging alone was dangerous. Todd started coming with her more often, too. That was new. For years, Todd had treated visits to my house like obligations he needed to survive. Suddenly, he seemed interested in everything. He asked questions about property taxes around the lake, insurance coverage for waterfront homes, and whether Richard had updated the heating system before he passed away. One afternoon, I caught him standing near the back windows, silently studying the shoreline behind the house like a man evaluating land he planned to purchase. Vanessa laughed when she noticed me watching him. "This house must be worth a fortune now," she said casually. I smiled, but something about the way she said it stayed with me long after they left. The following Sunday, they arrived carrying containers of takeout from an expensive Italian restaurant in Chicago. Vanessa kissed my cheek the moment she walked in. Todd offered to uncork wine. The entire evening felt strangely polished, as though both of them had rehearsed being thoughtful. Todd even washed dishes after dinner. That alone nearly made me suspicious. Outside, cold rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows, while Vanessa dried plates beside me. She kept asking whether I had been feeling tired lately, whether climbing stairs had become harder, whether I had thought about hiring someone to help maintain the property during winter. Then she reached into her leather handbag and removed a thick folder. She placed it gently on my kitchen table. "I just want you protected, Mom," she said softly. "These are standard future planning documents. Nothing dramatic." The papers were dense with legal language, paragraph after paragraph of small print filled with terms that blurred together under the warm kitchen lights. My eyes were already tired from the long evening, and Vanessa kept reassuring me that everything was routine. "Most older people wait too long to organize these things," she added carefully. Todd stood near the windows, with his hands in his pockets. He barely spoke, but every few seconds he glanced toward Vanessa as if silently checking whether things were going according to plan. I should have stopped. I should have read every page. But exhaustion does strange things to judgment, especially when trust gets involved. A part of me simply could not believe my own daughter would ever place something harmful in front of me. So I signed several marked pages where Vanessa pointed. The moment I finished, her entire body relaxed. She hugged me tightly and thanked me over and over, while Todd suddenly looked lighter, almost relieved. About 20 minutes later, they gathered their coats and prepared to leave. I remembered the lavender pots still sitting outside near the deck and stepped out into the cold backyard to bring them inside before overnight frost ruined them. Their car was parked near the driveway with the engine running. Then I heard Vanessa laughing. Not the warm laugh she used with me, a sharper one. Her voice drifted through the cold darkness from the half-open passenger window. "Mom signed everything," she whispered. "Todd, we got the lake house." For a second, I could not breathe. I stood frozen beside the lavender pots while icy wind rolled off the lake behind me. And deep in my chest, something terrible began unfolding. If you are still here and starting to wonder whether the daughter's concern was ever real, comment number 2 below. Trust me, the next discovery made this betrayal far more dangerous than anyone expected. I stood outside in the freezing dark long after Vanessa and Todd drove away. The lavender pots rested against my legs while the cold wind moved across the lake hard enough to sting my face. Somewhere in the distance, water hit the docks into slow rhythmic waves, but everything inside me had gone strangely quiet. I kept hearing Vanessa's voice over and over again. "We got the lake house." Not "we protected Mom." Not "we helped her." "We got the lake house." At first, I tried to convince myself I had misunderstood. Maybe she meant something harmless. Maybe Todd had been joking. Maybe exhaustion and grief had twisted ordinary words into something ugly. But deep down, I already knew the truth. I remembered the way Todd kept studying the house during dinner, the way Vanessa rushed me through the paperwork, the relief on both their faces the second I signed my name. None of that had been love. I finally went back inside and locked the kitchen door behind me. The folder still sat on the table exactly where Vanessa had left it. Under the warm lights, the papers looked ordinary enough, just white pages filled with clean legal language and signature lines. Yet suddenly they terrified me. I poured myself another cup of coffee, even though it was almost midnight, and forced myself to read every page carefully. The language was dense and exhausting. Some paragraphs stretched nearly half a page long. Others referenced legal authority I barely understood. I had managed household finances for decades, but these documents felt intentionally complicated. By 1 a.m, my chest hurt from anxiety. I carried the folder into Richard's old office near the back hallway and sat at his desk surrounded by framed photographs from our marriage. Richard smiling beside the first fishing boat he restored. Richard teaching Vanessa to ride a bicycle when she was 6 years old. Richard standing on the unfinished deck of this very house with sawdust all over his jeans. I stared at those photographs and felt ashamed, not because I had trusted my daughter, because I still wanted to. The next morning, I called my closest friend, Diane Porter. Diane was 71. Sharp-minded, and impossible to fool. Several years earlier, her grandson had nearly manipulated her into refinancing her home before she caught him forging documents. She listened quietly while I explained everything. Then she said something that settled heavily into my stomach. Nice children do not celebrate after getting signatures. By noon, I was driving north toward Milwaukee through gray skies and freezing rain. The farther I drove from Lake Geneva, the more I realized this was no longer a family misunderstanding. Something deliberate had happened at my kitchen table. Diane had referred me to an elder law attorney named Harriet Collins. Harriet was in her early 60s with silver hair cut neatly above her shoulders and the kind of calm expression that made people immediately tell her the truth. She invited me into her office, accepted the folder without comment, and spent nearly 20 minutes reading every page carefully. The longer she read, the more serious her face became. Finally, she removed her glasses and folded her hands. "Mrs. Mercer," she said carefully, "this is not standard future planning paperwork." She explained that mixed inside the documents were several dangerous legal authorizations. One was a quitclaim deed connected to property transfer rights. Another granted broad financial authority. There was also medical proxy language that could eventually allow Vanessa to make healthcare decisions on my behalf. I felt physically cold hearing it explained out loud, not because of the documents themselves, because my daughter had handed them to me, knowing exactly what they meant. Harriet asked whether Vanessa and Todd were having financial problems. I immediately thought about Todd's failed investments, the expensive lifestyle, and Vanessa constantly asking about the value of the house. Harriet nodded slowly. If additional paperwork gets filed, she said, this could become very serious. But right now, you still have options. Then she leaned back in her chair and asked quietly, Mrs. Mercer, do you want to fight this quietly or publicly? I looked through the office windows at the freezing Milwaukee streets below and understood something terrible for the first time in my life. Sometimes the most dangerous stranger is your own child. When I returned home from Milwaukee, the house felt different. Nothing had physically changed. Richard's fishing jacket still hung beside the mudroom door. The cedar floor still creaked softly near the staircase. The lake behind the windows still shimmered silver beneath the gray November sky. But the safety I once felt inside these walls had started slipping away. Now, every room carried a question. What exactly had Vanessa tried to take from me? Harriet Collins had warned me not to confront them yet. She told me calm people made better decisions than angry ones. Her advice was simple: observe everything, sign nothing else, and let people reveal themselves naturally. So I stayed quiet. Vanessa called constantly after that dinner, sometimes twice a day. She asked whether I had reviewed the paperwork again, whether I had any questions, whether I had been feeling tired lately. Her voice remained warm, but beneath the sweetness I could hear impatience pressing against every sentence. Todd began appearing more often, too. One afternoon, he walked slowly around the property with his hands in his coat pockets while Vanessa sat in the kitchen drinking tea with me. Through the windows, I watched him studying the dock Richard built 15 years earlier with his own hands. Richard spent almost 3 summers finishing that dock. He measured every board twice and refused to hire contractors because he wanted every part of this property to belong to our life together. Todd looked at it the way a developer studies land before demolition. Later, he asked questions about electrical upgrades, shoreline permits, and septic inspections. Another day, I caught him taking photographs of the guest bedrooms while he thought I was upstairs. The realization hurt more than I expected. Places filled with memories for me had become numbers for them. One evening, Vanessa stood near the fireplace sipping wine while staring toward the lake. This property could easily sell for over $2 million now, she said casually. Todd nodded immediately. Waterfront buyers are paying insane prices lately. I pretended not to notice how naturally the conversation came to them. That night, I started searching through Vanessa's social media accounts more carefully than I ever had before. For years, I avoided judging her lifestyle because parents are supposed to trust their children. But suddenly, the signs became impossible to ignore. Luxury hotels, designer handbags, endless expensive dinners. Then hidden underneath those glamorous photographs, I noticed angry comments from investors asking about delayed payments and failed business deals. A few posts connected Todd to something called Hale Development Group. I had never heard of it before. The following week, another piece of the puzzle arrived by accident. A bank envelope was delivered to my mailbox with Todd's business name partially visible through the paper window. I almost returned it unopened until one phrase caught my eye. Pending collateral review. Below that were the words, waterfront property. My stomach tightened immediately. I brought the letter straight to Harriet the next morning. She read it carefully, then looked at me with the same calm seriousness she always carried. They are attempting to leverage your property for financing, she explained. Even if the transfer is incomplete, they may already be presenting the house as future collateral. For several seconds, I could not speak. This was no longer about family concern or future planning. This was strategy. Harriet then asked a question that made my chest feel heavy. Has Vanessa mentioned moving you somewhere smaller? I thought about every conversation from the past few months. Assisted living communities, easier maintenance, safer places for older people, less isolation. Suddenly, all of it connected. They were not planning for my future. They were planning for my removal. That night, I stood alone at the end of the dock while freezing wind moved across the black water beneath me. The entire shoreline was silent except for the creaking wood under my shoes. Richard built this house board by board, and for the first time since all of this began, I realized something with complete clarity. If I stayed soft-hearted, I would lose everything he spent his life building. So standing there in the cold darkness beside the lake, I made a decision. I was done simply defending myself. Now I was going to fight back. After my meeting with Harriet Collins, I stopped behaving like myself. Not completely, just enough. I delayed returning Vanessa's calls by an hour or two. I repeated small details during conversations as if my memory had become unreliable. Once, while she visited for lunch, I intentionally forgot where I had left my reading glasses, even though they sat directly beside my purse on the kitchen counter. Harriet believed people revealed their true intentions fastest when they thought they were winning. She was right. Vanessa immediately became more aggressive in ways carefully disguised as concern. She mailed brochures for assisted living communities near Milwaukee and Madison. She sent links for meal delivery services and private home caregivers. Every conversation suddenly included phrases like safety, stress reduction, and making things easier. Todd became even worse. He started speaking about the future of the house as though ownership had already transferred. One afternoon, he stood near the fireplace, studying the ceiling beams, while casually mentioning how valuable lakefront renovations had become in Wisconsin. You could simplify your life a lot by downsizing, he told me. This place is too much responsibility for one person now. I nodded weakly and pretended to consider it. Inside, I was watching every word. The pressure from them felt different now, faster, sharper, almost desperate. A few days later, Harriet called with new information from the private investigator she had hired. Todd had been communicating with a real estate investor in Naples, Florida. He had sent photographs of my property along with descriptions of future development possibilities. In one email, he referred to my home as a future acquisition property. Reading those words physically hurt. Richard built this house with his hands. He spent entire winters sketching improvements at our kitchen table while drinking burnt coffee late at night. And now Todd was quietly marketing it like an asset waiting for liquidation. Harriet told me we needed stronger evidence of intent before confronting them directly. So we created a controlled situation. 3 days later, I called Vanessa and told her I had slipped slightly near the dock while carrying firewood. It was not entirely a lie. I had stumbled briefly, though I was never in danger. Vanessa reacted with alarming intensity. Within an hour, she arrived at the house with Todd, both acting as though I had narrowly survived a disaster. Todd immediately inspected the stairs and dock, while Vanessa hovered beside me asking repetitive questions about dizziness and confusion. The next morning, she insisted that a physician she trusted completely should evaluate me. The man who arrived introduced himself politely enough, but something about him unsettled me instantly. He asked strange questions that felt less medical and more investigative. Dates, financial awareness, memory recall. Whether I ever forgot appointments or became disoriented while driving, I realized exactly what was happening. They were building a case, guardianship. If they could portray me as mentally declining, controlling the house would become much easier. So I kept performing. I answered slowly sometimes, pretended to struggle remembering minor details, lowered my eyes at the right moments. Every small hesitation made Vanessa visibly more confident. Later that week, Harriet forwarded me another discovery. Todd had exchanged messages with a realtor in Florida discussing property transition after occupancy transfer. Occupancy transfer. Not if I left. When? That Saturday evening, Vanessa sat across from me at the kitchen table while soft snow drifted outside the windows. Her voice carried that same rehearsed gentleness I had started recognizing months earlier. "Mom," she said carefully, "maybe it is finally time we help you make easier decisions." I looked at my daughter for a long moment. Outwardly, I let my shoulders sag slightly, like a tired old woman overwhelmed by life. But inside, every legal document, every recording, every safeguard Harriet and I prepared was already waiting. Finally, I nodded softly. "Maybe you are right," I told her. "Why do you and Todd come next weekend? We can finish the paperwork then." Vanessa tried to hide her excitement, but I saw it flash across her face immediately. Todd looked almost victorious walking toward the door. I stood at the window after they left and watched their car disappear through falling snow. Neither of them had the slightest idea what was waiting for them. The week before Vanessa and Todd returned to finish the paperwork, Harriet Collins finalized everything. Every safeguard, every document, every legal barrier they never imagined existed. The house Richard built was transferred into an irrevocable trust, protected by clauses so specific and airtight that Harriet called them tripwires for greedy heirs. One clause mattered more than all the others. If any beneficiary attempted to manipulate, pressure, or unlawfully obtain estate assets before the authorized transfer date, their inheritance could be dramatically reduced or removed entirely. Vanessa had no idea she had already triggered it. Harriet also froze every pending transfer connected to the original quitclaim documents I signed at my kitchen table weeks earlier. Quietly, without warning anyone, she shut every legal door Todd thought he had opened. Meanwhile, I gathered the evidence piece by piece: the recording of Vanessa laughing in the car, the collateral review letter mentioning my waterfront property, emails Todd sent to the realtor in Florida, photographs he secretly took inside my home, the investigator's report detailing Todd's attempts to market the property before ownership had legally transferred. Harriet spread everything across her conference table one afternoon while snow drifted outside her office windows. "Our goal is not revenge," she told me calmly. "Our goal is prevention before permanent damage happens." I nodded, but deep down, I still felt grief sitting heavier than anger. That grief followed me home every night. I kept remembering Vanessa as a little girl, running barefoot through the same house with the lake water dripping from her swimsuit. Richard used to call her his sunshine girl. Even during difficult years, he never stopped believing she would grow into someone kind and steady. Sometimes I sat awake wondering when money became more important than the family. The following Saturday, Vanessa and Todd arrived exactly on time. Todd wore a charcoal suit despite the heavy snow outside, looking less like a son-in-law and more like a man attending a real estate closing. Vanessa carried another leather folder pressed tightly against her chest. The lake behind the windows looked pale and frozen beneath the winter sky. I served coffee while pretending my hands trembled slightly from exhaustion. Todd noticed immediately. His confidence became impossible to hide. Vanessa finally placed the folder on the dining table and smiled gently. "This is the final transfer paperwork, Mom," she said. "After this, everything will be much easier for you." I lowered my eyes and slowly picked up the pen. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then I signed. Vanessa exhaled softly with visible relief. Todd leaned back in his chair, almost smiling. That was the moment I opened the drawer beside me and removed a large manila envelope. The room changed instantly. Before either of them could speak, Harriet Collins stepped through the front door carrying another file box in her arms. Todd's entire expression tightened with confusion. Harriet calmly sat beside me and began laying documents across the table one by one. The trust paperwork, the inheritance fraud clause, the investigator's report, the frozen transfer notices, printed emails, financial records. Then finally, the transcript of Vanessa's phone call. We got the lake house. Vanessa's face lost all color. Harriet folded her hands calmly. Mrs. Hale, she said, your actions have already activated the fraud protection clause inside Mrs. Mercer's trust. Any future inheritance distributions are now under legal review. Todd slammed his palm against the table so hard the coffee cups rattled. This is manipulation, he snapped. She set us up. Harriet's voice never changed. And if you continue threatening or pressuring Mrs. Mercer, we proceed publicly Monday morning under financial elder abuse statutes. Vanessa suddenly started crying. Real crying. Not polished tears. Panic. She stared at me like she no longer recognized the woman sitting across from her. Finally, I spoke quietly. I heard you that night, I said. Outside the car. I heard you laugh. Silence swallowed the room. Todd pulled Vanessa to her feet, while Harriet gathered the evidence back into neat stacks. For the first time in months, as I looked around the house Richard built, I no longer felt afraid inside it. I felt in control again. After Vanessa and Todd left my house, I stood at the living room windows for a very long time watching snow fall across the driveway. Neither of them looked back before getting into the car. The tail lights disappeared slowly through the white storm near the end of the road, and when they were finally gone, the silence inside the house felt heavier than anything Todd had shouted at my dining table. I expected relief. Instead, I felt grief. Todd had always been an outsider to me in some ways. Ambitious, restless, always chasing bigger things than he could hold on to. But Vanessa was my daughter. I carried her, raised her, sat awake through childhood fevers and broken hearts in every ordinary moment that mothers never forget. And somehow she still became part of this. Harriet stayed another hour after they left. She reviewed every document again and reminded me to save all future messages or emails from Vanessa and Todd. She also warned me not to meet Todd alone under any circumstances. He is cornered financially, she said carefully. People under pressure make dangerous decisions. Before leaving, Harriet shared more information from the investigator. Todd owed money to multiple investors connected to failed development projects in Illinois. One lawsuit was already being prepared. Several accounts connected to his business partnerships were reportedly frozen. Driving expensive cars suddenly made much more sense to me. So did the vacations. So did the polished social media photographs designed to look effortless and successful. The entire life Vanessa displayed online may have been balanced on debt the whole time. A week passed without a single call from her. No texts, no apologies, nothing. Then another envelope arrived at my house by mistake because my address was still connected to the property transfer paperwork Todd had filed earlier. This one came from an attorney's office in Chicago. I should have returned it unopened, but seeing Todd's company name through the paper window stopped me. Inside were legal notices involving defaulted investment loans, threatened litigation, and urgent demands for repayment. I sat alone at the kitchen table realizing something painful. My home had not simply been attractive to them, it had been necessary. The lake house was their final escape route. A few days later, Harriet called again, and this time her voice sounded colder than usual. During additional document searches, she discovered something that had never officially been submitted to the court system. A draft psychological evaluation? My name was on it. The report described supposed signs of memory instability, cognitive decline, and impaired decision-making. It suggested further evaluation for possible guardianship review. For several seconds after Harriet explained it, I could not speak at all. They had actually planned for this. Not just taking the house, taking my independence, taking my voice. Harriet assured me the draft had never been formally filed, but she also said something I will never forget. Intent matters, she told me quietly, and this proves intent very clearly. That night, I walked alone down to the dock after sunset. The lake had started freezing near the shoreline, thin sheets of ice cracking softly against the wooden posts Richard built years ago. I remembered something he once told me during an argument with a dishonest business partner long before Vanessa married Todd. The worst kind of theft, Richard said, is when someone steals your dignity first. Standing there in the freezing dark, I finally understood exactly what he meant. Vanessa and Todd did not only want my house, they wanted to turn me into someone powerless enough to surrender it willingly. And as I stared across the black frozen water, one terrible truth settled permanently into my heart. This was never a misunderstanding. It was betrayal. Several weeks passed without hearing from Vanessa. Winter settled heavily over Lake Geneva during that time. Snow covered the dock behind my house, and the thin ice spread farther across the shoreline each morning. I returned to my old routines because routines were easier than thinking too much. I brewed coffee before sunrise, read beside the fireplace at night, and shoveled snow from the back steps even when my hands ached from the cold. But something inside me no longer felt the same. The hardest part was not nearly losing the house. It was realizing I no longer felt completely safe with my own family. One gray afternoon in February, I heard tires crunching slowly over fresh snow outside. When I looked through the kitchen window, I saw Vanessa climbing out of her car alone. No Todd, no expensive coat or polished makeup. She looked exhausted. For a long moment, I stood at the door without moving. Months earlier, I would have opened it immediately without hesitation. Now, I found myself studying my own daughter carefully before turning the lock. She stepped inside quietly, wrapping her cold hands around a cup of coffee I offered her. Neither of us spoke at first. The old kitchen felt painfully silent, except for the ticking wall clock and wind moving across the frozen lake outside. Finally, Vanessa started crying. Not dramatically, quietly, like someone too tired to keep pretending. She admitted Todd pushed most of the plan from the beginning. After several failed investments, they were drowning financially. Loans piled up. Investors demanded repayment. They were close to losing their own home. The lake house became the only way out, she whispered. I listened without interrupting. Vanessa explained that at first Todd only wanted to borrow against the property temporarily. But after their financial situation worsened, his plans became more aggressive. He started talking about guardianship proceedings, competency reviews, and moving me into assisted living permanently. I looked directly at her. And you agreed to that? Vanessa lowered her eyes and did not answer immediately. That silence hurt more than anything else she confessed. Eventually, she admitted Todd hired someone to prepare a draft psychological evaluation describing me as mentally declining. The plan was to pursue emergency guardianship if I resisted transferring control of the estate. I started getting scared of him, she said softly. For the first time since all this began, I saw something besides greed in her face. Fear. Todd blamed Vanessa after the confrontation at my house. He accused her of becoming emotional and careless. According to her, they were barely speaking now and living almost separate lives under the same roof. As she cried at my kitchen table, I remembered something Richard once told me years ago after Vanessa followed bad advice from difficult friends in college. She lets stronger people decide who she becomes. Sitting there across from her, I finally understood what he meant. Vanessa was not innocent, but she was not entirely unreachable either. Then she said something that nearly broke me. I became someone Dad would have hated. My throat tightened instantly. For one dangerous second, I almost stood up to hold her the way I used to when she was little. But I did not. Too much had happened between us. When Vanessa finally left, snow was falling softly again outside. I stood at the window watching her walk alone toward her car beneath the gray winter sky. And deep down, I understood something painful. Some fractures inside a family never fully disappear, but at least now the truth was no longer hiding in silence. If you are still here and feeling the weight of everything this family has survived, comment number 8 below before we move into the final part of this story. Because some endings do not bring peace without leaving scars behind first. By early March, the ice on Lake Geneva had started breaking apart. Each morning, I watched thin cracks spread slowly across the frozen surface, while pale sunlight returned to the shoreline for longer stretches every day. Something inside me felt similar, as though a season of fear had finally begun loosening its grip. Harriet Collins kept me informed about Todd's situation. Lawsuits connected to Hale Development Group were now public. Investors wanted repayment. Financial records were being examined. Todd eventually left Chicago and moved to Florida after separating from Vanessa. I did not feel satisfaction hearing any of it, only exhaustion. People like Todd usually believed consequences happened to other people. But eventually, greed collapses under its own weight. It always does. Vanessa rented a small apartment in Madison and quietly started over. Her social media accounts became almost empty. No more luxury dinners, no more staged vacations or smiling rooftop photographs. For the first time in years, her life looked real. We started speaking again carefully. Short phone calls at first, brief conversations about weather, work, and ordinary things neither of us knew how to rebuild yet. The warmth between us was damaged, but at least the pretending was gone. I learned something important during those months. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting, and it certainly does not mean surrendering your boundaries again. Harriet finalized every remaining legal protection around the estate. The trust was secure. The house was protected completely. For the first time since that terrible night outside the car, I could finally breathe without fear sitting in the middle of my chest. As spring approached, I slowly returned to myself. I took the kayak back onto the water one cold morning just after sunrise. I replanted lavender near the stone path behind the house. I invited friends over for dinner again. Little by little, life stopped feeling like survival. One afternoon, while cleaning the hallway closet, I found Richard's old winter coat buried behind several boxes. Inside one pocket was a folded receipt with handwriting across the back in faded blue ink. Protect what we built. I sat on the floor holding that note for a long time while tears finally came. Not from grief this time, from relief. That evening, I stood alone on the dock watching the lake move freely again beneath the fading spring light. I had protected the house, but more importantly, I had protected myself. Spring returned fully to Lake Geneva by the end of April. The lavender beside my stone walkway bloomed again, soft purple against the warming earth. Every morning, I carried my coffee down to the dock and watched sunlight spread slowly across the water while birds skimmed low over the lake. From the outside, my life probably looked very similar to the one I had before all of this happened. But I was not the same woman anymore. For a long time, I believed growing older meant becoming weaker, easier to dismiss. easier to frighten, easier to control. What I understand now is that age gives some women something much more valuable than strength. It gives clarity. I started volunteering with a local community group that helped older adults understand estate planning and financial protection. Harriet Collins occasionally joined me for those meetings. She once told me that most victims of financial elder abuse never expect danger to come from family members. I understood that better than anyone. The people most capable of hurting you are often the people who know exactly how much you love them. Vanessa still called sometimes. Occasionally, she visited for coffee. Our conversations became quieter and more honest than they had been in years, but the distance between us never completely disappeared. Some things survive betrayal, others change shape forever. One evening near sunset, I sat alone at the end of the dock, remembering the moment I heard Vanessa laughing in the car that night. "We got the lake house." At the time, those words felt like the worst moment of my life. Now I understand they may have saved me. If I had never heard that call, I might have surrendered everything little by little until there was nothing left of my independence at all. In the end, I did not survive because of money or legal paperwork alone. I survived because I finally chose to see the truth clearly. As darkness settled gently across the lake, I stood up from the dock and walked slowly back toward the house Richard and I built together. Age does not make a woman powerless. Sometimes it is the very thing that teaches her when to stop surrendering. Sometimes the deepest betrayals do not come from strangers. They come quietly, through familiar voices, shared memories, and people we once trusted without hesitation. But life has a way of revealing truth exactly when we need it most. And sometimes pain is not there to destroy us. Sometimes it arrives to wake us up before we lose ourselves completely. Growing older does not mean becoming weak. It means learning the difference between love and surrender. It means understanding that protecting your peace, your dignity, and the life you built is not selfish. It is wisdom earned through experience. And perhaps the hardest lesson of all is this: forgiveness and boundaries can exist together. Thank you so much for spending this time here and listening to this story until the very end. If it meant something to you, share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories like this, please like, subscribe, and follow the channel for more heartfelt journeys and meaningful stories.